join us.
It's a study session, so you have to.
Woodmen Hills Metropolitan District study session for October 3rd, 2018 is session.
Go?
Go.
Okay, I was asked to do kind of a bond 101, to remove the mystery of bonds and to help you understand what this district has outstanding obligation. I'm gonna go to the very basics, so hope you're not insulted, but yeah, if I go to the very basics, I think you'll understand that there really isn't that much mystery to a bond. Computations, yes, but not mystery. Okay, so we all know what an IOU is. It says, I, Eric Stowe, owe Nicole $1,000. Now, most people won't go with just a verbal IOU, they get into more formal ones. And so the kind of the lowest form of security is a promissory note. And I just took the first page of a simple unsecured promissory note. And technically, a promissory note is a signed document containing a written promise to pay a stated sum to a specified person at a specified date. So if you look at this one, I'm borrowing money from my wife. She's Georgianne Becker. And it says borrower agrees and promises to pay lender, my wife, $10,000 together with interest at the rate of 8.25%. The promissory note will be repaid on or before March 31, 2019. Also, please go ahead and ask questions at any time. This is a work session. So if I'm not clear on one of them. So that's your simplest form, and it's unsecured, which means there's no collateral. You've signed them for buying a car or buying your house and that sort of thing. There you're gonna have a lien on the title of your car or a mortgage on your house. A bond is really no different. Okay, this is the phase of bond this district issued in the spring of 2016. It's just the first page. They're a lot longer than that. As you can see, the investor here, or the lender, is Key Government Finance. The borrower is Woodmen Hills Metropolitan District. The borrower promises to pay to the registered owner, which is the investor, the principal sum specified above, which is $16,200,000, together with interest at the rate specified at 2.75%. That really is the essence of a bond. But now, fasten your seatbelt, because this is where it gets fun. You have a question?
No, I'm sure you're gonna get to it, the difference between the bonds and the certificates.
Well, I'll do that right now. That's the basic of bond. And certificate is just another form of a bond. As are notes and some other things, a lease-purchase agreement or an installment purchase agreement, they're also forms of lending. And I'm gonna be very careful because we have Tabor, and I'm gonna also distinguish between what's considered debt under our Constitution and not debt. You have to vote debt, you don't have to vote non-debt financial obligations, as long as they're structured properly. I'm gonna read from Tabor. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with that acronym, Taxpayers Bill of Rights, which was adopted in 1992, I believe it was. And if you take a look at that, required elections, districts, and that includes all municipalities, counties, special districts, and everything. That's a term that is used under this amendment. Must have voter approval in advance for creation of any multi-fiscal year direct or indirect district debt or other financial obligation whatsoever. So, where you're going to see certificates is when we have like the district, enter into a lease-purchase agreement where they have an annual appropriation right and an annual right to basically not renew that lease and walk away from the property. The way we raise the money to fund that lease is to sell certificates of participation. And all those are a certificate that evidences the owner's right to receive a portion of payments as they're coming into the trustee from the district. Otherwise, the same tax rules apply, the same Tabor rules apply. You gotta make it satisfy Tabor. It's just that with lease purchase transactions and installment purchase transactions that are structured properly, and this includes this PFA we're gonna talk about here in a minute, our courts have all approved those as long as they're structured with a annual appropriation or an annual right of the district to basically terminate that lease, so that it's not a multi-fiscal year obligation, it's just 1 year at a time. And at the end of the first year, it renews for another year, and so on. And if the district does choose to not appropriate, then that instrument terminates and the trustee comes in and takes the property. So there's not a mortgage, because governments can't mortgage property. And what we do in this structure is we have the title of the property, whether it's equipment or real property, held in a third party, lessor. Sometimes it's a trustee, sometimes it's a nonprofit corporation that we set up specifically for this, like the PFA that we did in the late 90s for this district. So, to answer your question, there's a form difference, but the substance is the same as a bond. So, when Woodmen Hills was set up in 1995, I had the service plan had to be approved by El Paso County. And El Paso County gets to dictate certain terms of the operation of that district. And the county chose to impose a $5 million limit on debt. This is where we have to distinguish between debt and not what we refer to as non-debt. What you have to vote on and not vote on. So we started out working with, and of course the district had no revenues when it was dispersed here, the first couple of financings we put together. So we structured, we put together this nonprofit corporation. And under our federal tax code, in order for bonds issued by this corporation to be tax exempt, the district board had to adopt a resolution appointing the board of the PFA, approving the bonds it was going to issue and the projects it was going to build, and agreeing that the district would take title to those improvements once either the improvements were finished or the bonds were paid off. Some people do it different ways. In some cases, it was the county that took over some of the improvements that were done with this PFA. And to generate, of course, you can't borrow money unless you can show you have revenues to pay the debt service on the money, on the borrowing. So initially, the developer allowed assessments to be imposed on all the lots. And then the intent was, as the lots were sold, the assessment would be collected, put into with the trustee and an account to pay the bonds. And then as we developed some of the infrastructure and were able to start generating revenues, then this entity, the PFA, the Public Facilities Authority, could issue its own revenue bonds and pay them supposedly from the revenue that the district's getting for operating the facilities and pay them over to the PFA to pay its bonds off. With me so far?
Yep.
Okay. So if you look at this chart, You got the district at the top, and this was because we had this $5 million limit. And even the initial facilities that were listed in the, original service plan was, I think it was about $20 million worth of improvements that had to be put in. So we had to come up with other ways. In fact, they did not want the district to ever impose a mill levy. I don't know if that's still the case, but, the county wanted this district to be strictly a revenue operated district, which fits in with Tabor, because, Tabor's also where the concept of an enterprise comes in. An enterprise, and that's just a government-owned business, which is like your water and wastewater enterprise and your recreational enterprise are. Government, the district owns those businesses. And different districts handle them differently. They incorporate a separate entity to be that enterprise. I don't think you've ever done that. You just have it as an accounting, mechanism, enterprise, which is acceptable. That enterprise has more flexibility in entering into multiple fiscal year obligations. So that's, we can enter into a long-term lease or installment purchase agreement with the enterprise versus the district itself. Now, the district still controls the enterprise, but this PFA that we set up was not intended to be an enterprise. It was intended to be a nonprofit corporation that was able to issue bonds on behalf of the district outside of the limitations that were set in the service plan to raise the additional monies that were needed to put in the facilities. And then, and so you got the district here at the top, and you got, what the district did was approved resolutions, multiple resolutions. I started going through my records yesterday. I was gonna give you a list of all the different transactions we've done over the years, and it had my head spinning. There were so many of them. But I decided to just tell you, everything was consolidated down to 3 things in 2009. And old leases and everything were eliminated then. And you had, I think, 2009 revenue bond issue and 2009 leases, if I remember correctly. And then in 2016, we came in, refunded those. We got rid of those because the district had finally matured into good credit risk. Now, all those years when we started with just dirt out here, and Greg Fulton was the investment advisor, and he got some banks and investors to invest and buy the bonds at 8% interest, which sounds high for now. But back in 1995, with a district that had no assets and no revenues, and risk goes into those loans also. So it wasn't an unreasonable loan interest rate at that time. But as the district became operational and more sophisticated and was able to meet its obligations, that gives it the opportunity to bring that interest rate down, which is what happened in 2016. It went from 8% down to the 2.75. I think that's on both the lease and the revenue bond. Why did we do a lease and a revenue bond in 2016? Now this is getting down to what your obligations are. Again, we had that, the service plan has been amended twice or modified twice, and the now maximum debt under your service plan is $16.2 million. So we did a revenue bond issue for $16.2 million to stay within that limitation. And the revenues from your your water and wastewater enterprise are sufficient to pay the debt service, if everything goes all right, to pay the debt service on that revenue bond. And I think we established a reserve fund too. Yeah, there's a reserve fund behind that revenue bond. That reserve fund, yes?
So you were saying the revenue
Well,
bond,
I'm sorry, questions, this is not a, questions are not to be asked. It's a study session,
Oh,
it's a working session, according to SDA regulations, there's no questions
Oh.
from a member of the public.
oh, okay.
It's SDA regulations.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll
SDA doesn't
hopefully
have
answer it
regulations, it's a
here.
trade association.
So we refunded the three 2009 obligations. There was we had to take some proceeds from each of the 2016 revenue bond and the 2016 lease. But the 2016 lease was primarily to finance the new sewer plant. And that's an annually appropriated lease, so it complies with Tabor. I think there's a single certificate of participation. I don't know why they even wanted that. Sometimes, because it's all one investor. This Key Government Finance is the only investor. Normally, you only have certificates of participation if there are multiple investors, so that each investor has its own evidence of its investment. Some of these investors, they'll go ahead and be part of the lease purchase agreement, but also take a certificate of participation, but that has to do more with their bank regulations and how they handle that transaction internally. It's weird sometimes. There's a single certificate of participation on that 2016 lease. I understand you have some questions about some payments you're still making on what look like old obligations. You need for me to go into that?
Yeah, no.
Okay. I mean, I think the 2016 transaction is pretty straightforward.
So the lease agreement only covers the water and wastewater facility.
It's only, the only revenues that were pledged were the water and wastewater, that's right. They took the recreational revenues out of that. I think only for simplicity purpose, you know. Since the water and wastewater revenues were sufficient to support the debt service on that bond, we decided not to make it any more complicated by including the recreational enterprise revenues. Even though there were recreational enterprise transactions that were refunded. And that's perfectly legal.
Well, that's what I'm trying to understand, is reading the actual bond itself. It covers water and wastewater, and then the recreational funds as everything being refunded and then combined. So if we're combining the bond at $16.2 million, then what's the lease for?
The lease is primarily for the new sewer plant,
Yep.
and it's being paid from your general fund. And it's annually renewable, even from becoming a debt that would have to be voted under Tabor. So each year when you do your budget, you effectively renew that lease. And if you don't, then the bank gets to come in and take your sewer plant. But that,
So what comprises the $16.2 million of the bond?
well, in fact, I didn't make copies of this, but, let's see. I'm sorry, I didn't copy that.
Okay.
Okay, so here's the bond, the lease purchase agreement, and some cash that the district put in. As part of the whole transaction. And here's what we did with the proceeds. So refunded the water wastewater revenue bonds from 2009, the recreation facilities bonds from 2009, and the lease purchase agreement from 2009. Those are those first three numbers. And then we put 11 million into the treatment facility fund, the new one you're
Well,
building.
so that's what I'm saying, see the difference, we said we refunded these bonds,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yet this $2.89 million is still being accounted for in this lease purchase agreement.
Yep.
That's
Not
it.
in the bond. This $2.89 million, I just went and read the bond again last night in preparation for this meeting, and this $2.89 million is still being accounted for in the current lease agreement with the PFA.
Yes, it is. Okay.
For Parks and Rec, but this is showing that that money was refunded,
Yeah.
so I don't understand why we're still,
Well, you may be using recreational facilities revenue to pay on the lease.
yes,
because you could pay from whatever monies you put in your general fund.
But I thought it was
Now, you may
written,
be out-
I
you may
thought
be
it was
accounting
written to
for it.
where that was just for the water and wastewater treatment facility.
The lease purchase?
Yeah.
No, some of the proceeds were allocated to refunding some of those other things. The limitation had to work around was that 16,000,002 limit in there, so we had to raise the amount of the lease to get the rest of the funds needed to complete the whole transaction.
And I only ask these questions because it's why I'm such a
Well,
jerk
why
about
I'm
these
here.
other districts giving us our money they owe us. Because if we got all this money tied to this PFA and the bond, it's like we're just rolling over crap over and over
Well,
and
no,
over.
the
again.
PFA isn't the lessor in that, in the new lease.
Well, the bank is, but it's through the PFA.
No, the only thing that's outstanding on PFA now is those 1999, 2001, 2003, and 2007, I think, were those bond issues that were basically released from the PFA and all the land. There was, in 2012, the courtyards, I think, is the only property that's still responsible for the assessments. And that was deeded in lieu of foreclosure on the assessments over to the trustee, Greg Fulton, basically, GGF LLC. And when we put those financings together, these assessments that I mentioned were recorded on the property and then assigned by the district to the PFA, and from the PFA on the same day assigned to the trustee for the bonds. So technically, the money should have gone directly from the district to the trustee bank and never through the PFA. Sometimes that, things happen and they get rerouted because people forget whether they're supposed to send a check, but technically all that money collected on those assessments or tap fees should have gone to the trustee. Then, when they did the deed in lieu of foreclosure, that really didn't involve the district per se, other than what I'm about to get to on these tap fees. The tap fees and everything that had been assigned to the trustee to pay those bonds were assigned to this new trustee, GGF LLC, and it was supposed to collect them as they were collected by the district to pay the bondholders on those bonds that they were pledged for.
So if the bond's through UMB, right?
Correct. Well, the trustee is UMB.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the lease agreement is through Key Bank.
Yes, Key Bank's the investor, but I think UMB is the lessor. Yes. If I remember correctly.
And that's what the question I'm asking with this stuff is why are we still paying PFA?
For those courtyard houses.
Yes, it should be, the only money you should be paying over to the trustee for those bonds, or the PFA, whichever way you wanna look at it, are the tap fees up to $10,000 that you're collecting on the courtyards properties. This assignment,
Yes.
In 2007, raised, as part of the action that the board did in 2007, they raised the tap fees for residential to $10,000. And then that was assigned to the trustee for those bond issues that I mentioned, those bond issues. And then anything over the 10,000 was supposed to be the district's. So I talked to Katie Walker. She's the one that knows the numbers over there at GGF. And she said she got a check from the district in July and didn't have an accounting. And she has been trying to call Peterson, what was it, Lisa? And wasn't getting the call back because she went ahead and deposited the check, but she doesn't know exactly what it's for. So she wants to get together with you guys and figure that out. But the only thing you should be paying over to the PFA, if you wanna look at it that way, are the $10,000 of the tap fees, of each tap fee that you collect in the courtyards properties.
Right.
And that was assigned back in 2007.
Yeah.
Now, who sent the check in July?
Yeah, we did a check in July.
Oh, you
Yep,
did?
yep.
Okay. Have you been in touch with Katie lately?
No, I actually haven't. I saw one email from her and I've been meaning to get back to her. I have all the addresses that we did it off of,
Okay,
separated out
okay.
exactly.
Well,
what
she said the
numbers.
dollar amount was just odd to her too.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I'll
I
talk
asked
to
if
her.
she would come down and sit with you
Yeah,
and go over the spread, you know,
Tax return for
just
PFA.
have an agreed to spreadsheet so that you.
yeah, that would be
Because,
nice.
it's a limited obligation, but it is still there. Now, as I understand it, those courtyard lots were all sold, the summer of 17, I believe, last summer. a year
Yeah,
ago,
yeah.
Summer, and that's why they're now being developed.
They're all
again.
being developed, yeah.
I think the deed in lieu of foreclosure happened when Jerry Olish died, and they were wrapping up that business. And then it was, went over, the property is held by this DGF, or was, and the bond owners were members of that LLC also. So that, they just kinda kept the land with the assessments on it, and then they sold the land, I believe last summer, a year ago this summer. And, that's why it's now being developed.
Yeah,
And they paid off, did a partial payment on the old bond issues. And I got a call from the attorney from Boulder who was helping Greg Fulton square it away because one of the 1999 bond owners thought he had a priority in line on these assessments, and so we worked out, there wasn't really any sort of priority. She basically divided out pro rata.
Hi, everybody.
And
I left at 1:30 to get here.
it's all right.
3 lanes of I-25 closed.
1:30?
Sorry, Ben. 3 hours, my apologies.
So,
Last board meeting, I got here an hour early.
Did you were very early.
So, what's that? That was of 2016, I didn't get 17 yet.
so what direction are you getting? From whom?
for what?
For the payment, for the check that you sent to,
That was from Lisa.
that was from Lisa?
Yeah,
Okay,
so she set all that up, that was like right
so it's
before
not
she
like you got
left.
a bill from,
No, we didn't
Katie.
get a bill, there were some emails that Lisa had been sending back and forth,
okay,
and then we cut a check, and then that was like right towards the end, and then, so we just had it signed and sent. But I do have a spreadsheet with the addresses and the numbers that she came up
Okay.
with, so
okay.
I should be able to talk to her.
Well, maybe,
We can-
maybe you can share that spreadsheet with Katie and me, and then
Yeah,
three
yeah.
of us can, even by telephone, just, go over and make sure that,
The numbers are right
Yeah.
and where they go, yeah, absolutely.
but that's the payments that are still being made. It's from the tap fees, cause I think all the assessments were taken care of as part of the sale of that land. So the assessments had to be taken off the title before they could convey it to this new owner. So that was all worked out last summer and applied to what they had, applied to the bond owners. Now that all is left are these tap fees that are coming in. And once those are all collected, there should never be another payment.
Right, yeah, that's,
Hi. How far along are you?
Well, I think we're about done.
Oh, good. There's perfectly. So you went through, what is the bond?
Yeah, I think.
You went through whatever the 2 kinds, I think there are 2 sort of kinds of bonds going on right now.
Well, you know, let me address that a little bit. In just the bond world, you could have general obligation bonds. That's the multi-fiscal year type, payable normally from tax levies, okay? But that's the one that basically you're so restricted in your service plan, even as.
No taxes.
Well, no taxes. You This is one notation. So the El Paso County Commissioners really did intend this to never be a general obligation bond district. But that is one type of bond you'll hear the name of. The other is the revenue bonds, and that's where it's payable strictly from the revenues of the facilities you're financing. Or the general fund, I mean, you can use the general fund of the district if you have monies in there.
Are people clear the difference between general obligation, which a GO bond is, and special bonds, if you will? Clear, not clear? No, okay, that's what I needed, we needed to hear.
If we didn't have this restriction, you would have had a vote on election, okay, to issue general obligation bonds. And you would have authorized the district board to apply unlimited mill levies to pay those bonds. And that is a true debt,
And GO
full
bonds,
general obligation.
GO bonds are commonly what municipalities issue. There are over 2,000 special districts in Colorado. Why? Because the services that you all provide are not GO obligations of a municipality or the county, okay? So it's an unusual scenario that was established initially so it doesn't end up on people's tax statements as a general obligation of the municipality. These separate entities, like Woodmen Hills, are set up so that it's not an obligation of Peyton or Falcon or Colorado Springs, okay? Very, very common process, over 2,000 of them.
In fact, municipalities and counties don't want to finance the facilities because they know they'll get flack from, you know, if they tried to do it with countywide taxes, of course, other areas of the county would say, wait a second, we want to pay for their brand new sewer system over here. So that's why special districts became so common in Colorado. They really went booming in the 60s.
Mhm. And he and I think initially got involved with the one in Castle Rock that went bankrupt. Tweed Kimball, Cherokee Ranch.
Sure.
It's not commonly the case that special districts go bankrupt, but it has happened, and the one I'm talking about was just right outside of Castle Rock.
Well, as a matter of fact, you have to have special law statutes, state statutes, to allow districts to go bankrupt. And I think ours sunsetted years ago.
Mhm.
So right now, most of us, there's some people out there with a theory, but most of us believe that special districts are not legally allowed to go bankrupt. Which means if you voted a general obligation bond, you would be required legally to impose whatever mill levy it took to pay those bonds.
Okay,
And that's why El Paso County Commissioners didn't want this district to have that ability.
Okay, so to back up a half a step, you're talking about the generally two kinds, the district has two bonds, if you will, it's dealing with. The one that I never get right, the 99 and the 2002 and the 2003 and the 2005,
In 2007.
in 2007, we talked about that already?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, so you're clear there, that's one set. And
Those
the,
are the BFA.
well, the second set is the $16 million 2016 bonds, okay, and you've covered those.
Well, we have, but I think Troy still has some questions about
The
the
big
county.
question he's asked me is, does the district owe any money? That was your question. The answer Eric gave was no. Then if the district doesn't owe any money, why is it writing these checks to PFA all the time? Okay, and that you covered?
Yes, but maybe we can clarify it more. That's under this assignment of the gap fees from 2007.
Okay.
And in 2007, to back up these bonds with 99 and 2003, 5, and 7, there were assessments placed on the Metropolitan Club, the fire station site, the courtyards, and some pads and adjacent strips around Safeway. Now, I've been told that everything except courtyards is all paid, and it's gone.
Do we know how much is yet due in courtyards?
No, but we're gonna figure that out.
Well, I mean, if they were built out in
What
in
is
17,
What is old courtyards, they were sold, lots were all sold a year ago this summer.
Was that 150 lots?
One
I don't remember.
36.
Yeah.
They're about, and that's why there's new development going on right now. And the assessments that attached to those lots last summer were released, paid and released.
Ah,
That's why we had to do that to be able to convey the property free and clear. But what's still outstanding is this assignment of the tap fees on those lots. And that's where the money is flowing. And that's up to, it's 10,000 per residential lot. And I don't know if there are any commercial lots in that.
I don't know.
And anything over 10,000 and the tap fees, district keeps.
okay.
So the district only needs to send GGF LLC, the trustee, for the still outstanding bonds, 10,000 of each tap.
Are you seeing a surplus?
Money?
Mhm.
Yeah, we charged 14,409 for our
So
taps.
there's 4,000 and change
Yeah.
theoretically coming to the district as income, if you will.
Yeah,
Okay, and have you determined, or maybe that's what you figured out, how much is still owed yet on those?
that's what we're gonna work on.
Okay,
She's got a spreadsheet that was leases. And
Yeah.
it shows the addresses that have been paid and everything. So I think she and Katie and I can get together.
all right.
I'm just gonna help so I can.
Yeah.
It's comfort to you, you know. and Katie's good, really good with numbers, so
Okay.
I suspect you are too.
And then, if you talked about the relation of Tabor to this whole scenario,
We did talk about it.
okay. So y'all are clear why it's, I hate to use this word sleight of hand, but somewhat of what they need to do to be able to pay the bills and deal with the Tabor obligation at the same time.
We like to say comply with Tabor.
Fair enough, okay. So, Claire, Shira, you're okay with us so far? Okay, now, one of the things I've learned, let me go to 16. The 16, the checks paying the 16 million, or 19 million, the checks are written by the district to PFA, correct? Who are the checks written to?
UMB.
You'll be trustee.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Which leads to where I was going.
The
Which-
PFA shouldn't be receiving any money.
Got $200 and some $1,000 check.
As for the tap fees, we sent it to the PFA,
That's to the
which
others.
you guys, which they got, GG got.
GGF
Yeah.
LLC, that's the successor trustee to UMB.
So,
That's-
I mean, we could.
That's
cut
where I
out
got
the
confused of
PFA, I
what the
think.
different entities were.
Yeah.
Okay.
When they did the deed in lieu of foreclosure in 2012, they took the property into this GGF LLC. It took over the trusteeship responsibilities from UMB, and the bond owners are members of this LLC, so they just kind of.
Talking with the lady who's involved in that, she said they really did it on a gamble. They hadn't seen any money for years and they didn't know if they were ever going to, and then things now have finally sorted out because the lots have been sold.
Well, yeah, what triggered all this was when Jerry Olish died.
Mhm.
He was the only working partner of Falcon. And so they were wrapping up Falcon's business and they just encapsulated the courtyard's property, the bonds, and the assessments, and the tap fees assignment into this entity. And you're basically trying to liquidate it all and now get rid of the bonds.
Yeah,
Clear?
clear.
Okay.
So everything prior to 16 will be paid off when this is done with,
As far as the district's
is it
concerned,
Courtyards or is it Courtyards West? Which one is it?
Well, I think.
Courtyards
Are there
West.
two?
It's west.
It's Courtyards West, I believe, yeah. Courtyards at Woodland Hills West.
I mean, because if those were sold, all those were sold in last summer,
Yeah, and they're being developed this year,
And they don't pay tap fees until they're
until there's,
being developed.
a tap thing.
That's why the money is still flowing.
Yeah.
Does the CO trigger that, certificate of occupancy? What triggers the need to pay?
When they get their tap set up, so as soon as they need water and sewer.
Oh, really? Okay, so it's not a CO, it's right at the front end, not the back end. All right. Okay, now, the question's been floating behind all this. I learned when you were kind enough to send me all those checks,
Yes,
and then I sent those to Eric. You explained that you can tell which bond they're paying because of the legend you put at the top left
Yeah,
of the check, right?
yeah,
Did I say that right?
yeah, I just sent you like a chart of accounts,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Okay, so, A, you've got, a chart of accounts, if you will. And then separate on the checks themselves, it also tells you
Yeah.
on the check, so you've got a cross-reference as between the two of them.
Yeah,
All right.
Now, I'd be shocked if your audits don't reflect what's going on here, but I looked at your, 2017 hasn't been posted yet.
yeah, we have it,
Yeah.
we need to get it up.
They just came through with big smiles on their audit, they did
Yeah,
really,
I'd
really
be
well.
shocked if it isn't discussed in the notes.
Yeah, it's there.
Yeah.
Cause yeah, we're using the lease bond to pay for the wastewater treatment plant. All the checks that are going for that, and that's pretty much, that's the only checks you see going out, and then we pay to UMB.
Do you know off the top of your head how many bonds you're writing checks on?
Just the two.
That's what I think too, but
Yeah.
I'm just checking. Okay.
Just to, when you came in, one thing I was trying to help clarify is why there's a 16 million revenue bond
Mhm.
and a 19 million plus, whatever it is, lease.
Mhm.
The revenue bond is considered a better security because it's backed by the revenues. The lease is less secure because it's annually appropriated, so there's a greater risk.
And
So we
that's
try-
the complying with Tabor.
And the service plan.
Okay.
Oh, you mean?
The annual,
Yeah.
the annual reaffirmation.
That's to comply with Tabor.
Mhm.
Do a sleight of hand, if you will.
Okay. Comply, you taught me.
So, the investor felt more secure getting as much as it could under the revenue bond. But this is why we had some squirrely, shouldn't be using that, but that's why we had to allocate the monies a little differently, is because we wanted to max
No,
that.
I would classify it as squirrely.
It's all legit though. But we had to refund all those 2009 obligations, there were 3 of them. We were limited in the principal amount of the revenue bond to the 16 million to comply with your service plan. And so we had to pack extra under the lease to accomplish all the purposes of the whole transaction. So from our perspective, it was just an accounting of proceeds. From your perspective, it sounds like you're questioning why you're spending recreational enterprise monies on the lease that is only for water and wastewater facilities. Is that what your question is?
I just question the duplication of the two. The
Duplication?
way they look duplicated as far as the lease agreement and the bond.
Well,
Other
should
than
they
the,
duplicate?
other than the rec facilities revenue that was added to the lease purchase agreement.
If you try to just look at the transaction as a whole, there was a refunding, what we call refunding, and new money. The new money was for the wastewater.
Did the refunding effectively pay off the old money?
Yes,
That's what I thought. Okay.
but so did the lease.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, they were both parts of the whole transaction, but that was because of the limitation we have in your service plan.
But by analogy, if you build a house, sometimes you get a construction loan in order to build a house, but then you have a permit or a takeout of that, and that pays off the construction loan, plus there may be more money at the top. Okay, go ahead.
So, that's why I did this. Where's Alex? I'm sorry I didn't make copies of this. Could we make?
I don't believe it's working.
Oh,
I
okay.
took a picture of it so I
All
could
right.
look at it while you're talking about it.
What we did, we had, I got my sources here, which were the proceeds from the 2016 water and wastewater revenue bond, the proceeds from the 2016 lease purchase agreement, and then the district threw in some cash of $2,135,000. To get like, I think they just didn't want to incur any more obligation than they had to on the debt side, if you will. So they had that to put in there, probably from one of the enterprise funds, so they could minimize the principal amount of the 2 deals. So then we had a total of 38,334,773, and then we allocated that to these uses. That was refunded the 2009 water and wastewater revenue refunding bonds, refunded 2009 recreational facilities revenue refunding bonds, and the refunded the 2009 lease purchase agreement.
Yes, no,
So,
Corey?
What? No, it doesn't.
so we basically flipped the money from here to here.
That's my construction loan, permanent loan analogy,
Yeah.
yes.
So this money.
These are the sources,
Just flips it.
and this is how they were used, and they balance. This is the reserve fund we funded. Now, that's just for the revenue bonds, 2,312,000. And this is the new treatment facility, 11 million. But then, because of this 16.2 restriction in your service plan, we had to basically up the lease purchase agreement to this level, so we had enough to complete the refunding part of this transaction.
This was noticed as a public meeting, and there are members of the public here. Do any of them have any questions? Sir?
You can ask a
Back to
question.
Troy Stinson's question.
Pardon?
Getting back to Mr. Stinson's question, or Mr. Stowe, you made the comment, in 2007, according to the 2007 assignment of tap fees, who were the parties to that 2007 tap fees? I don't have a copy of it.
To the assignment,
Yes,
the district
okay,
and the enterprise,
okay.
which are one and the same
One and the
really,
same.
assigned the tap fees to the PFA.
Okay,
See, the district's the one with the authority to impose the tap fees,
yes.
and they assign them to the PFA in consideration of doing these improvements.
That goes to my question. All of the documentation that I have in my possession that I've seen shows in 2005, the owners were joint ownership between Falcon Properties and Woodmen Hills Metro District of the Metropolitan Club. In 2008, the Metropolitan Club was sold by one entity only, which was Woodmen Hills Metro District. Who paid the tap fees prior to and/or during the development in 2005 through 2008?
That I don't know.
That's what we're trying to find out.
Oh,
Okay. Send me an email or something, okay? Because he's here on bond issues, and that's not a
Right.
bond issue.
Well, but it goes to, in Metro Club, I never knew that you stated that the Metropolitan Club was part of the assignment of these tap fees, and it was actually owned by Woodmen Hills.
Yes.
well, everything was on, Woodmen Hills, the
Yes.
district?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
Oh,
The deed of trust for 2008 to Journey Homes lists the seller as Woodmen Hills Metropolitan District. You have the same look on your face as the county commissioners when they said, what was the Metro District doing owning residential properties?
what was it, this Metro District? I have no idea, I'm sorry.
But pose the question, and if we
Yeah.
can find out, we will. I mean,
I'm
it's a
glad to
fair
find out.
question.
Yeah,
Okay, but Eric's here on bond issues. This is not a bond issue directly. I understand where you're going.
because Metro Club would have had to
Okay.
pay the tap fees. and
All
so
right,
we're
well,
trying to
just
find out who pays it.
send me an email, please, with the question, and I'll see what I can do to find out the answer. Okay? Hang on, Mr. Pace, just a second. Are you through, sir?
In 1995, the Recreation Center charged a $5 per door fee for 1,080 homes, was the original, what they charged. When they went and included it and changed it in 1995 to, what was it, 1990, or 2001, with the promissory note issued by, Mr. Seussville, it was for each home to pay $35 a door on a 20-year note. Whatever happened to that note, because I don't see a satisfaction or a relinquishment or anything of that note, it just disappeared into the netherworld. And then when they brought in courtyards or filing 11, there was 1,000 more homes, and those homes were assessed $35 a door.
Okay, again, my question is, what does that have to do with the bond issues?
Because it's all the financing, he admitted that in the bond restructuring, they used, according according to the 1995 service plan, it states you shall have 2 enterprises, and only 2. A water and wastewater and the park and rec, and they should have separate accounts. You had just admitted that they used funds from park and rec to pay for the leases on the water and wastewater, correct?
Under the restructure in 2016,
Yes.
Yes.
So
We-
why did?
we
why
are-
did they
Let
do
let him,
that under
excuse me,
service plan?
let him answer your question.
the only revenues that were pledged, I don't know what you're using on a day-to-day basis. The only revenues that were pledged were the water and wastewater revenues, enterprise revenues.
Does that answer your question?
Well, it goes back to the
No.
argument that park and rec fees were actually being used to pay the lease agreement for the lease on the water and wastewater, which.
And
the
how are you
service
proposing
plan-
that be addressed today?
The service plan specifically states that the resident shall not be responsible for payment of any infrastructure.
So your point is
My
that
point
residents
is
are
park and
paying
rec
for.
fees should never been
Yeah.
used to pay for any infrastructure.
Okay, but let's presume that's true for sake of discussion. I don't know. What is that, why is that relevant today?
It's relevant because every homeowner is sitting there wondering why, if we're going to have all of this additional debt, and park and rec is not going to park and rec, that creates a problem.
I don't know the answer.
That was part of my question with the bond, is
Yeah.
the bond specifically states that water and wastewater funds will be used to pay
The bond,
the bond.
but we're asking about the lease, aren't we?
Well, in reality, both of them say water and wastewater is being used to pay them, but neither one of them says that Parks and Rec is is to be used to pay either one of those.
Right.
So the question being is, if water and wastewater is a separate enterprise than Parks and Rec, if there's Parks and Rec revenue left at the end of the year, it should be held in its own account.
Okay, and so,
It shouldn't be used to go back to, it shouldn't be used to pay for these bonds or just water and wastewater. I'm pretty sure that's what they're.
and is that your point?
That's my understanding.
That is my point.
All right,
Yes.
so the question, hang on, so the question posed to Eric is, if I've understood y'all,
Yes.
is park and rec money being inappropriately, if you will, used? Is that fairly stated?
Well, it's fairly in sense of the 1995 service plan that's been amended to allow.
Hang on, you're telling me the history watches. I'm just asking you the time. Is that the issue that you want addressed?
Yes,
Okay, all right. Then, and the issue is park and rec money being used where it shouldn't be used, or said the other way, what is, and does that pick up your question, Troy?
Yes,
Okay.
that's what, and I'm trying to, that's why I'm looking at all this, trying to think through this, because I see where, only $2.89 million of this debt is Park and Rec's debt. The rest of it is water and wastewater debt.
There you go.
And
So Eric, can you pursue the
Yeah,
answer?
I mean, for one thing, I don't know that those restrictions you're talking about are in the service plan. Does
They
the
are.
service plan
They are.
says
specifically states.
only Parks and Rec money can be used for Parks and Rec and
Yes,
it
sir.
can't be used for anything else?
There's supposed to be two
Yeah.
separate accountings,
Yep.
two separate line items.
Yeah, but having two separate accounts but using it for other things, the lease is being paid from the general fund. So whatever can be legally put in the district's general fund is usable for the lease payments.
so then my other question would be, what is required to be in the general fund to repay that lease?
Enough money to pay the lease. That's the only requirement. And I don't mean to be flippant, but
No, that's fine.
we're specific we're very specific in the pledge of the revenues from the water and wastewater enterprise for the payment of the revenue bond. Okay, that one's clear, and that, I assume, there's sufficient revenues so that that's clearly paying the full debt service on that bond. So that's shouldn't be a question. The question comes in with this lease purchase agreement. That, we may have mentioned that, I can't even remember now, so I don't want to speak out of it. I'll research a little more and come with more definitive answer. But that is technically payable from the general fund. And that's why you have to have the right to not renew that lease every year. you make an appropriation from your general fund. Now, the question is it appropriate for Parks and Rec money to go into the general fund of the district?
Which has already been one of your questions.
Under the enterprise concept in Tabor, district money can't go into the enterprise, up to 10% of the revenues of the enterprise, but without losing the enterprise status. But enterprise money can come back to the district under Tabor. I don't know about the service plan yet. We're gonna have to take a look at that.
All right,
But you'll lose your enterprise status if money goes from the general fund of the district.
Corey, what are you giving me?
Service plan.
The original one?
You can scroll, so that talks about.
So, Mr. Stiver,
Yes, sir.
debt.
to my simple mind, your question right now is the use of the Park and Rec money.
Yes.
Okay. Now, Mr. Pace, you've been dying to ask a question. What is your question?
Not dying, I was dying before I walked in here, but,
I can tell you're having a,
yeah, I'm having a wicked day, so don't worry about it, no big deal. Mr.
Stowe.
Stinson,
Oh, excuse me.
was hitting the nail on the head. He needs a little bit more information. I brought the tax return for the PFA for a reason. I shuttled it around to everybody.
Hang on, I'm trying to get to what's your question.
I'm gonna get there in a second, so I'm not in the courtroom, so a little leeway.
No.
So we had.
What's your question?
No, I'm sorry, what was that? You say no?
What is your question?
Did you say no?
I said, no, you're not gonna tell me what I can or can't do.
I said I need a little leeway to get to the question.
I heard you and I didn't agree with you. What's your question?
And I got no question. I'll
No?
wait till the meeting's over,
Okay,
okay?
all right. Anybody else? Anyone else got a question?
Actually, I do have a question. Mr. Stowe, would you be available to answer questions for me after the meeting, like you said you would at the last meeting?
No. If you have questions, ask them now.
Don't talk to me like that.
I'm gonna talk to you any way I choose
No,
to.
you won't.
Yeah, let's keep it simple.
No, you
We're not,
won't.
I'm not gonna argue with you.
Hang
No.
on.
If you want, if you have questions of Mr. Stowe, you're
Hang on.
welcome to ask them
Hang
now.
on.
I-
Just hang on,
yeah.
alright? I wanna be able to hear everybody's questions, so let's just let it go. Go ahead with your question.
Thank you,
please.
Mr. Stinson. Mr. Stinson, along those lines, as he stated earlier, there was an increase in the COP from $5.8 million from the original COP, and you refinanced up to 19.2, correct, about that number?
No. A lot of that 19.9 is new money.
19,
Not
okay.
refunding.
How much of it is new money?
I would put the 11 million in there and the reserve fund, cost of issuance. So you got about 14 plus million of the 19 is new money.
All right. In the refinance of the COP, which I don't know if you wanna call it a refinance, there was a payoff of an old COP, or what we call a retirement, correct?
Yes.
And that retirement was $5.863 million of the
That was one,
original
yes.
COP, correct?
That's right.
Okay, but the total was, I think, 6.4 or 6.2, according to the DA Davidson worksheet that they showed, because there was money for however they appropriated it, there was extra money, right? And so the COP that was retired, so we do have monies, the $5.8 million, so what we had left over. I asked a question I've asked before, where'd the money go? I know it was in an original COP, and I've asked this question because I downloaded the COPs from the county and the state. And the question I got was, nobody could tell me who received almost $6 million. My contention was it went to the original COP issuances, which if you look back at what you talked about is in here, some of them are in here. So he's not allowing me to talk to you after this meeting. So my question is, on these obligations that are listed in the PFA, how much of them are tied to any kind of tap fee or any revenue? Because if we're not responsible for their debt, the question I had was, in the back of this 990, which I haven't seen this year's yet, because I usually get them, but they asked for an extension. There's a lease agreement for 8.1455702. Do you know what that is? If you wouldn't mind, Cause before, it was down at $5.2 million. Now it's all the way up to 8.1, as far as I could track back, so it's gone up $3 million, but just wondering what it was interest, and I asked for a copy of the lease, and they said it was in the bonds, and I couldn't find it. So would you happen to know what the lease is? Cause it's a lease with Woodmen Hills, and it says in some of the tax returns, it's a loan. And then I asked for the loan documents, and they couldn't produce the loan documents. Don't know. Okay, thank you.
Fair questions, thank you.
Yeah,
Huh?
who prepared the?
It's on there, so it's every, you can have that, I print that up every year.
Okay, I'll be glad to take a look at it and see if I can figure it out, but.
If you could you, if you have my email, maybe you could tell me where the lease is, cause I'd like to know what it is and what it's attached to. Cause it's, as you said, it's for construction within and outside of the district, and if we're not obligated to it, but we still have a lease on it, where it says Woodmen Hills is the lease people, or a loan, I guess we owe the money, or not money, or whatever you wanna call it, we have some
I
obligation.
mean, is it possible that they're still accounting for the whole price in their accounting for the whole build out over there? For their tax purposes?
I just don't know without talking to whoever prepared this.
So what,
What I'll do is I'll get the information and give it to the district.
super, and then maybe they could give it to me, cause I'd like to see it, if that wouldn't be too much of a problem.
It's public information.
I've been asking for it.
Well, any other questions?
No, sir, I'm golden.
Okay,
I think, I don't know the Sarah Knight, but she's the paid preparer, so,
okay.
and so, I may have to have your permission to talk to her.
Well, we can't
You
take
control the
action at this
authority.
meeting.
I'll try to get in touch with her and see what she needs, to authorize me.
Ma'am, you have a question?
I don't have a question, it's, I live in Courtyards West, and there is a Courtyards HOA, which is behind Safeway.
Yeah.
And so it's very confusing, because I think legally it is different. So in reference to Courtyard West, with the tap fees, the property that was just sold in 17, it's not Courtyards, it's Courtyard West.
That's right, it's Courtyards West.
But all the references were to Courtyards.
And
top,
to-
all the references.
To Mr. Pace, as I have said to Mr. Stiver, if there's a question you want to pose, that would be welcome. Okay? I don't know if we can answer it, but we would welcome the question. I have no idea whether we can answer a 1995 and a 2003 and all those, those are somewhat ancient history, but you pose fair questions and we will see what we can do to answer them. Okay?
It's really not a question, folks, but this is what Mr. Stiver in the documents I dug up at the county while I was sitting in Vicky Rattery's office. In the updating of all the service plans, it specifically states that the Board of County Commissioners did not wanna, quote, the word was burden any residents with debt. And that was very specific, they made a big stink out of it, and it was all in the documents I put on my website, showed to the, not a board then, now, the people now, and it was specifically stated that they did not want to have these enterprises commingled, that one would be the other, that's why they set up the resolutions and fee structures the way they did, starting with what Mr. Stiver related to. So my question to you is, sir, if there is it was a lease, right, Mr. Stiver?
It was a promissory.
Promissory note. If a promissory note, according to our records that were filed at the county, was rolled, this building was rolled into that building for $1.8 million. Does that promissory note go away, or does the money that they received or were able to charge as a result, does it go away? Because according to that promissory note, as he was stating, there is no record of a release of that note anywhere, in any record. And I'm assuming that if we, like you said, either old or new money, right? You said there's old and new. So if we rolled it into a bond, somebody had to get something from that note. That note was $20 a building. At $1,080, you add another almost $1,000. That I think Mr. Seshmill, in the letter I posted on my website, said it would take 14 years to pay off that promissory note. So what happens to a promissory note? Real simple question. If you roll it into a bond, does it get paid off and it's done? Or do you keep collecting on the basis of that note?
Depends on how it's structured.
And that's what,
Because
okay.
If it had been paid off in increments out of the general
Oh, no, I mean,
It
the
would've been
obligation
paid
may
off.
roll right into the new,
It would have been paid off in 2017, in August of 2017.
oh, I don't know.
And so the question then becomes, sir, Mr. Stowe, is that what this board does not know, and I'll try to explain the best I can, if there was a $20 obligation specifically for that promissory note for those years, then that $20 should come off at some point, because then it would lower itself as a result of that, because even though maintenance goes on, and I think the operational cost goes almost $35, right? 5 for whatever, 10 for maintenance, and 20 for debt. And it even said it was predicated on 10,080 homes. So when we started building over 10,080 homes, the debt gets paid off faster. Because now you're putting every home with the $20. If you get to 2,000 homes at $20 a month, that's 40 grand, 40 times that is 480 grand a year. So see what I mean? You start rolling numbers. So that's what I mean. The debt at one point, that's my question to you is, if the promissory note was an obligation based on 1,080 homes, which it was done as, and we exceeded the 1,080 homes, we should have been able to pay it off, accelerated rate. So if it wasn't rolled into the bond, or the bond was still collecting, the amount of money we've collected for that $20 is in the millions. What happened to it? Maybe I'm not asking the question right, but do you see what I mean?
I mean, I'm not familiar with those two, my memory isn't familiar with those two promissory notes, but I may have some record of it in my file, which I'll be glad to take a look at. What's happened sometimes, and I think 2009 was basically a restructure because there were financial problems, and sometimes they extend the maturity of the financing. So it may have originally been intended to mature in 2017, but because of the financial difficulties, when they restructured it in 2009, they may have extended the ultimate maturity date.
There's no document to support that.
The documents should say that.
It doesn't.
I have the bonds. They do not, sir. I have it all. I read them. So yeah, it's kind of like 600 pages.
My condolences.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Okay. If your questions are framed, and you've done a fair amount of narrative, so I'm not sure, at least I know I can lose the question in the narrative. If you can pose the questions, which are fair questions, I'm not negating that would help us focus on the answers. Okay? Because Eric's world is the bonds. I'm hearing beyond the bonds. Your questions, Mr. Tabor, were beyond the bonds. So it may draw others into the discussion. So as you help pose the question, that in turn will help pose the answer. Okay?
We sending them to you?
That'd be great.
You're not going to charge us, are you?
Mr. Stiver,
Yes.
part of the problem with that service plan, Corey showed me the language,
Yeah.
is we've had to interpret what the commissioners meant over the years because they use the term debt. But this district has no way to enter into real debt
Right.
on a constitutional perspective.
Right.
So in trying to stay within the spirit of that limitation, that's why we limited the revenue bonds to 16.2 million. Those revenue bonds are not debt, but we tried to live within the spirit of that limitation. So likewise, this language looks like I agree, it looks like they wanted the revenues from financed facilities to go to pay off the financing for those facilities. They used pretty general language, and one could argue, and this is probably why we were comfortable with it, if you're using recreational enterprise revenues to pay a part of this facility, this water and wastewater lease, it's okay because some of the proceeds of that lease went to pay off financing that was used for the recreational facilities. So it's really being used within the spirit to pay off a portion of that lease, even though we didn't specifically pledge the recreational enterprise facilities toward it. Legally, it's okay for those to go into the general fund of the district and be used to
Well,
pay.
I don't dispute that. If you have excess revenue off of the tap fees, you're only obligated to 10,000, and as you say, if you take in 14,000, that 4,000 is just general fund money. You can use it for whatever purpose you want. My whole issue started with the promissory note and the obligation, which basically set in place that a certain amount of money would be 1995 and did an appraisal on this building. This building is nowhere near, at that time even, worth $900,000, because I have commercial properties and I know what the sizes were back then and what their pricing was. So it benefited Falcon Properties, obviously. But the point is that there's no document that extinguishes that promissory note. There's nothing that says, this is what happened, it's gone, and we rolled it into another document or into a bond. There's nothing there. It just sort of disappeared into the netherworld. And then you added on another 1,000 homes. Instead of it going down, it's as if they continued to keep charging everyone the same price. And as they added on other
Right.
developments into the district, they just kept adding that money. Well, the problem is that money was originally obligated for park and recreation facilities,
Right.
not
Does
for.
the bond still exist? The note still exist?
He
Yes,
does,
sir.
there's nothing that shows that it doesn't exist.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
It's
No,
been recorded.
There's something that shows that it does exist,
Yes, sir.
but there's nothing to show that it doesn't exist,
No.
is that correct?
No.
No,
It
sir.
was paid off. Right.
Or was paid off?
It wasn't, according to the 2009 bond.
And what you're
sir.
saying is that if it were paid off, then that particular assessment should be stopped.
The, the lease is, the promissory note's recorded, it was at the county, the building where I found it, at the recorder's office. And what they did was when they made a bond, they actually created a bond, the original Park and Rec bond. Cause this building over here was only $1 million something, and this one was the 900,000. So what happened was, they never unrolled the promissory note, so that collection continues, is what happened. So, in no record anywhere, in any of the refinances, and I've got all of them, that I can find at the county and the ones with the commissioners, which is where, that's the best place to go, by the way. They got some of the stuff that wasn't recorded, or they didn't record it. There was, none of it shows anything where the promissory note has been,
Rolled into the
retired.
bond?
No, they show the rolling into the bond, and then the bond's being paid out, which is, we just kept borrowing more money against the Park and Rec till we got to 2.8 million, and then that's where we've been. And then in this last finance, which is the one Mr. Stenson was talking about, everything's been combined, which is what he's been speaking about. So everything was lumped into one thing, so we have one bond, according to what they did, and one COP, which, if the enterprises are supposed to be separate, that's where Mr. Steiger comes in. He's smarter than me on that, so that's where he asked me to go find some documents, and I went down and boom, 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 and that's when so yeah.
Mr. Chairman, you're okay with the discussion, you're finished, or whatever you wanna do?
Oh, yeah.
I'm fine with the
Okay.
discussion, that's what this
All right,
was for.
Eric, got any other comments on this?
I think the confusion is, the bond is paid from a very specific source,
Mm-hmm.
and it's limited to that source.
Yep.
In order to keep it from being in debt under Tabor.
That's it.
That's clear. Where it gets muddy is the lease payments are payable from the general fund of the district. And that can be from any revenues that can legally be placed in the general fund.
Absolutely. So here's where I think everybody understood that, right? Bonds are from one set of payments, and leases can come from another, correct?
Correct.
Right, so if they didn't retire a lease, or they didn't retire the promissory note, they can draw those funds out of the general fund. Is that what would that be appropriate to say?
Say it again.
Okay, so before a bond, we had a promissory note that came out of the general fund.
Yeah.
Well, that's where, according to these
Original.
documents, right,
Yeah.
so even if they never retired the promissory note, then would they be able to still then draw the money for that payment out of the general fund, with then the bonds having the part of that payment, the $1 million bonded building, that part of it was a bond, then have to come from, what did you say it was gonna come from, the
General
enterprise
fund.
itself, or however it was done?
General.
So does anybody understand what I just said? No.
You see a lot of blank looks.
Yeah, okay, so you said the bonds, explain the bonds again, sir, I'm sorry, how a bond payment, where that can come from?
The revenue bond,
Yes,
16 million too.
no, just original, any bond, just the ones,
Oh,
yeah, you know,
well, it depends on what, I don't mean to be evasive, but it depends on what was pledged for the payment of that bond.
thank you, let's go with the ones we have, like you said, please go down the $16 million road, Will.
Okay, right now, you have a 16 million to, well, you may have paid some principal down by now. It started out as a 16 million to revenue bond,
Mhm.
payable solely from water and wastewater facilities, enterprise monies.
Okay,
So that bond should be self-sustaining.
mhm,
Then you've got, because of this limitation in the service plan,
mhm,
I mean, it would've been nice if we could've raised the revenue bond higher. But we couldn't. Now, our opinion was it's not debt, so we could ignore the service plan, but we tried to stay within the spirit of what the commissioners saw as debt. And that's a layman's observation too. They say, how can you sit here and say we have a financial obligation of $19 million and it's not debt? So it's a very fine line that we have, that we're paid to make sure you're legal. So we maxed out on what we saw the spirit of the service plan allowing, the 16 million too, the revised service plan. Then we had to, in order to accomplish the rest of the refunding and new money portion of the overall transaction, we had to make the lease purchase financing larger than just for the new wastewater facility in order to refund the recreational facilities lease and get rid of it.
okay,
But that is now part of the obligation under the lease purchase agreement,
okay.
2016 lease purchase agreement. So that's why I think revenues from there's still outstanding financial transaction that went to fund these buildings.
Mhm.
And it may have been rolled over time and again, and that's very
That's where-
frequently,
And that's where I was going.
that's 98% of the districts in this state are that way.
Okay, yeah.
And it's really just a rolling process, because by the time you get finished, almost finished paying off a bond issue, the building needs to be rehabbed, you rebuild, and it's just a never-ending cycle, really.
Mr. Staver?
So would that
Oh,
be?
That's good. Hang on a second.
So
Corey?
would that be the reason that the lease coming from the general fund, is that
I'm sorry,
why?
what?
So if the lease payments coming from the general fund, that's why the park and rec didn't have its own account, it went into the general fund to pay the lease, correct?
Well, it probably has its own account, but somebody's going from
Right.
that account to the
Right,
general
to
fund.
the general fund,
Okay,
Which
Hang
then
on.
goes to my argument, which is, we had a promissory note that dedicated $20 per month per unit going specifically to Park and Rec, and because we were obligated under these bonds, what happened is probably during economic cycles, because they weren't getting tap fees, somewhere along the way, funds that belonged or should have been earmarked for Park and Rec ended up going into covering the bonds to make sure they could pay the debt on the bonds or the lease.
yep,
Which that explains why your Park and Rec got short-shifted.
So you were just mentioning a moment ago about how it just, by the time you would pay the facilities off, now it's time for refurbishing. So that's kind of where we're at, or certainly will be in the next number of years.
Yeah, the first 15 years was probably increasing debt just because you're increasing infrastructure and all the facilities. But once you're a mature district, you may
Right.
never see an end to debt. I mean,
Right,
it's just a fact of life, because your facilities will be worn out and you
Yeah.
need to build some new ones, and
Yeah.
you don't have the cash.
And your copy machine doesn't work.
right,
And your copy machine doesn't work,
Right.
and,
yeah.
districts are as poor savers
Yeah.
as,
Okay,
because, well, again, it actually comes back to Tabor.
yeah,
You can't save up enough money to do this because Tabor requires a refund. So if
Yeah.
you were able to get excess revenues, you really can't put them away for a rainy day.
so then
Tabor
how-
really forces you to borrow money.
Okay, Mr.
Well,
Staver,
and I
did your
think-
question
and
get
I'm-
answered?
And I'm pretty sure that's why the developers with like Meridian Ranch and some of these new districts that are specifically earmarking Parks and
Absolutely.
Rec money and mill levies,
Yep,
because then it can't be touched.
yep.
You know, I mean,
So.
board
that's-
members, good or bad, commissioners, good or bad,
Yeah.
are only gonna be in those positions for 4 to 8
Yeah.
years.
So why would they not have made Meridian Ranch? Meridian Ranch has mill levies, so they're just our neighbor. And yet we can't because of
Different commissioners at different times.
times.
I don't know
Different
when Meridian Ranch was
interpretations.
formed, but
So this was in 1995.
now, it may have been Falcon's intent to not make it a debt district too. You know, Falcon may have said, we want to create this so it's a revenue-supported district, and therefore the county commissioners put that
Mhm.
limitation in their service plan.
I may be
They were
way
very
off.
conservative.
I may be way off on this, but in the 2014 or 2016 reports, didn't Falcon convey to Woodmen its assets?
Public assets.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Okay, now, Mr. Pace, you wanted to ask something?
yeah, and I wanted to ask, you said and it brought up a question, as soon as you brought it up with Tabor allowing us to keep so much money, how much money, what cap is there set on this district for how much money we can keep in reserve?
I have no idea.
No, I was asking,
It's a rolling formula, depends on
Okay.
population growth and
Yeah.
inflation, and it's really complicated calculation.
Is it in Tabor?
But
4%, I think it is, isn't it? 4%?
Well, there's a reserve fund for, emergency reserve type thing and bill.
So if we're looking at a rec facility that in current, today's market is 1.2, and we can't keep that amount plus whatever we would need for the wastewater in a fund, what's our other option to fund something of this
Borrow.
magnitude? Borrow.
It's unfortunately, that's what Tabor really has.
So we could never put away money because of Tabor to build that,
There's an emergency reserve provision in there, but it's very limited.
right?
And if your revenues exceed this formula,
Mm.
you
Yeah.
have to refund them.
That's what I thought.
Okay, Mr. Pace?
That's what I was asking, so it's the 4%, that's where I was going. They can only charge us so much based on Tabor, correct?
That's right.
All right, so in that spirit, as you said, we would have to quote borrow money, one way or the other, or something to that effect. If we have a certain amount of reserve funds over that 4%, what happens to it?
It gets refunded.
Supposed to be refunded,
Yeah.
in any form or every form?
Well, there are different ways that they do it.
Right, I will try to formulate one hell of a question for you and send it to you, because it's not even for this meeting, but there was a question about how much we could keep in the bank in reserve, because we already have reserve funds that were set aside to you, like you said earlier, that we have like, I think it's 2.4, someone correct me when I'm wrong, right?
Now,
Isn't, that's
Districts
the-
can,
Yeah.
de-bruce.
they can de-bruce. I
And
love
And
that.
that's very common in municipalities all over the state.
But not in conservative areas.
Okay.
They don't like de-brucing.
But we're not
What is
de-bruced.
de-bruce?
De-bruce is you can have an election
Yeah,
and authorize the district to keep excess revenues.
Which would answer her question.
And
And municipalities
it
have
could
done
be for
that
a certain-
all over the
it
state.
could be for a certain number of years, it could be forever, and
For
de-bruce
police
is-
department, for roads, for whatever, okay?
The-
Hang on, Mr. Stiver.
The
we'll get
author
there.
of Tabor
Yeah.
is named Douglas Bruce.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's where the debrucing, because Tabor's not popular.
and he lives down the street from my father-in-law.
Okay,
He's
Mr.
currently
Stiver, you had a
in
question?
lawsuit again,
What it,
so.
what it comes back to is simply this, the reason Park and Rec has been basically short-shifted is because we never kept enough funds basically the district, in my mind, is operated on a deferred maintenance program during those years where it wasn't getting enough money in tap fees. And those, basically, that's why the Park and Rec is in the situation that it is. Sooner or later, when you do deferred maintenance, no matter what happens, eventually it comes up and bites you in the shorts. And
But
you
the-
end up with assessments, or you end up with borrowing money or something, because,
Isn't your premise a reserve, though?
well, the premise is the reserve, but.
But you can't have a reserve, that's what
Yes,
he's
you can.
explaining.
Well, the thing is if you take in and put money aside into the reserve fund, and then use what you have for maintenance and everything, in this case, that wasn't happening.
I'm saying you can't, under Tabor, you can't have a reserve. That's the problem, that's the point Corey was making a moment ago, is you can't, in a typical reserve scenario, you build up a reserve for capital expenses, new roads, whatever.
Well, that seems kind of odd, because.
I'm not disagreeing with you, I'm just saying that's what it is.
Homeowner associations are permitted to have reserves.
That's an
They're
HOA.
required to have reserves for capital.
Right, I was president of an HOA, and we build up a reserve to do roads, I'm not disagreeing with you, but that's not a public entity, not subject to Tabor.
Right, but.
And
if you
Corey's
had-
point was, what do we do if we can't build up a reserve? Eric's answer was, bond,
Well,
or debt.
Borrow
exactly,
money.
but the point is that the size of the amount of money that you would have to have, because you weren't able to do routine maintenance, because those funds were used to pay off another obligation, that's the problem. Even if you had the full amount, let's say you had $5 million in the reserves, and and you could spend it. Well, then you're back to where you started from, because now you're building up 5 million in reserves for the next building to go
Yeah, but
bad down the road.
You're starting with a false premise, and everything falls down from that. The premise is a reserve. As has been explained, you can't do that. So what is the solution? Debt.
Ted, I have a question.
Well, you
Sure,
just
hang on.
admitted you had a reserve of $2.4 million, did you not?
Oh, no, that's bond reserve.
Yeah, the only reserve we have
That's-
is obligated to the bond.
To pay the bonds.
It
That's
is
right.
a
Yeah,
bond
that's- I'm
reserve,
sorry.
it is specifically written in the bond. This is how much you will maintain as a
And
reserve.
that's to cover a shortage of revenues
Yes.
Bingo.
from your water and wastewater.
For example, the one I talked about in Castle Rock, what did I say the name of it?
Cherokee.
Yeah, Cherokee Ranch, there's an example exactly of what that 2.4 or 2.8, whatever, that would be an example where that money would be used, because the bondholders couldn't get revenue from, income, if you will, from the ordinary source. The reserve is there to deal with that.
And the other side of that coin is you can't use that reserve fund to do repairs on your buildings.
No.
Because it's specifically allocated as a reserve for bonds.
Okay, so we still have pending your question about Parks and Rec.
Mhm.
Okay, so that question is sitting, Eric's gonna look into it. Okay, question?
Yeah, Eric, isn't it the case that public entities, or at least some public entities under Tabor are actually required to have reserves? Tabor reserves is the term.
Well, I think they're referring to the emergency reserve, and there is a specific provision for X percent.
Right.
I'd like to find it, but
There is
it's
a minimum.
relatively small,
Yeah.
so you're not gonna
Right.
build a building with it. It's intended to be an emergency reserve for revenues, just like our bond reserve is intended to be a reserve for those bonds. But it's intended for emergencies. And you can build it up to a certain limit, and that's your Tabor reserve, but that it's too small to be of any use except in emergencies.
So if I've understood, I'm again trying to nail issues down. One is the promissory note, and the second is Parks and Rec money.
Well, Parks and Rec money, and the third one is who owned and developed Metropolitan Club?
Well,
That has nothing to do with today.
That's,
Well, because it involves the payment of tap fees. Were tap fees paid? If Woodmen Hills owned Metro Club, and there's 150 houses, and you were supposed to collect $10,000 a door from Journey Homes when it was sold in 2008, did you ever collect that money? Or did somebody, because they already owned it, didn't charge for it?
There were tap fees on the Metropolitan Club.
Yes.
Those were assigned along with the courtyard
Right,
to the trustee.
yes.
I have no idea about what
Who paid
happened.
them?
I-
Given
I don't
that-
even
that
have-
the
wouldn't
owner,
even have
the park
records.
owner at the time was Woodmen Hills Metro District.
Yeah,
I think if
that
you
seems
just put
strange.
your questions in an email, send it to us so we can look at them
Right.
and answer them. And I don't think that it's good for the public to have access to our attorney. I want all that correspondence to come through the district office.
Oh, agreed. Yeah.
I have your email, absolutely.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, I did have one more question, sir, and that was about the reserve situation. Does the
Which reserve?
The reserve,
For the bond?
the Tabor reserve
The Tabor
situation,
reserve.
forget about that, we're gonna stay away from that for a second. And because we were talking about de-Brucing, and I know Mr. Bruce, met him up close, real nice fellow. I'm being sarcastic, anyway. All right, so, does an account have to be called a reserve account if it's money? In order for it to have the designation of money that you can be called reserve? Say if we had $5 million in the bank and you called it, Ron's petty cash fund, or Corey's going out drinking fund, or Mrs. Vance's I need a new alarm fund. So just, does it have to have a specificity with the name of the account in order to do that? Because you said after a certain amount, they have to refund the money
The limitation in Tabor is on the revenues,
on revenue, okay,
and that's how it's controlled.
awesome.
And the revenues, in fact, a lot of districts got in trouble in this last recession because what happened was property values went down,
Yeah,
and that starts a whole new level, we call it ratchet down.
yeah,
So when the property values went down, the mill levies had to stay about the same.
yeah,
And as the values started back up,
yeah,
they can't take advantage of the extra revenue from those mill levies. They have to refund it because if they violate the formulas in Tabor.
yeah.
So
Okay.
even though you've suffered several years of short revenues because of this whole recession thing, you don't get to make up for the loss.
And the reassessment's done, what, every 2 years?
Every 2 years, and then you got Gallagher that places limits on valuations.
Yep.
And everybody knew it was gonna go down because
These
of the
districts are
history
hamstrung.
of the recession. So they're dealing with today's expenses and yesterday's income, so to speak.
My question is
Mhm.
that if we're talking Tabor and we're talking about debrucing and everything else, I understand how that works as it relates to bonds and taxes. This is a fee structure system.
Oh, no, it's revenues. It's not just
Revenues,
taxes.
That includes fees.
Oh, yeah.
How many
Yep.
out of all the 4,000 special districts in the state of Colorado, how many use the fee
2,000.
structure?
Well, I think all of them use the fee structures,
No, they don't, not according to DOLA.
well, whatever.
Yeah.
I don't have statistics like
This
that.
is the
It was just bonds, yeah.
So I have a question, so I'd like to kind of go back to, Ted, I believe you were saying that the way that we are set up is very common in the 2,000 districts in Colorado, correct?
Mhm.
So are we doing anything unusual that, maybe some of the other districts in the state are not doing, or?
Said the other way around, you have the restriction on property tax.
Right,
That's
Yep.
not, to my knowledge, that's not really normal.
yeah,
No.
in
It's
some
not
of my
normally
research,
property
but-
tax.
exactly, in my research.
That's
some
the
of
only
them-
one I can
A lot
think
of
of.
them have mill levies.
One thing, it depends on the type of facilities that a district provides.
Right.
If it's just intended for streets, you can't charge fees for streets
No,
normally, so
Right.
you're gonna have to rely on
Well, that's
taxes.
utility.
So,
Sure.
but most districts like Woodmen Hills that have revenue generating facilities will charge fees for those
For the services.
facilities, cause they would have to charge an outrageous amount just for O&M if they only
Right.
supported it through taxes.
Well, and the point is that you're saying that under Tabor, the district is restricted in how much it can raise in revenue. So if this board elected to raise the monthly fees for the park and rec, or for, well, let's say for the park and rec, from the $55.12, let's say, per month, to $100, all you would need is a vote of this 5-member board of directors and imposing it on the people. What restriction is there if they don't have to have a vote from the residents?
Isn't that really a philosophical question?
No, because that means that you don't have a cap on revenues.
No,
Under a fee structure,
no,
you
that's a
do not have
philosophical
cap.
question about whether the decision should be made by the board, by the general electorate. We wanna talk, don't wanna
No,
talk
I'm
about
not-
GE,
I'm
they
not
just
going
went
down
down
that path.
$500
I'm going
million.
down the simple path that you said didn't put, the path I'm going down is a cap on revenue. Has nothing to do with who votes for it, who approves it.
But your premise
Cap
when you
on
started
revenue
was the
simply
board
is
doing it.
If this board redid the restructured and said, we need to add a new rec center and we wanna increase the fees $15, okay? Let's just say it was $15 a month, or let's say it's $50 a month. What restriction is there on the revenue for them to do that? I don't see one. So that means your premise is not correct. That's why I said at the last meeting that I attended, I said the reason that Falcon Properties, when they structured this, went to a fee structure instead of a mill levy was because it's easier to control the way that you make the decisions from the board for a revenue situation than it does to have to always go to the voters.
That's a philosophic argument, and so.
That's how they
Well,
allow you to, I mean, that's why
and
you're
I'll-
authorized to sit
I'll
on
answer
committees.
that question, but it's a double-edged sword.
Sure.
Because as soon as you bring up mill levy out here, I mean, if people are standing on the roofs ready to dive headfirst off of them.
Absolutely.
When in fact, if a mill levy was imposed, that takes the power away from the board of directors in Woodmen Hills to
Absolutely.
make those decisions.
Sure, yes.
So that was one of those things that was,
And because of
being
expediency,
discussed.
because like I said, you would have to go through and revise the
Yes.
service plan, and
Yes.
then you would have to take the service plan.
2 to 3 year
commissioners,
process.
And then the commissioners would have to approve that, then you would have to get a ballot issue put together, get
Yes.
the wording put together, get that
Yes.
approved by the commissioners to get on the ballot, and it does,
You
like I
just,
said,
you
it
just
takes
made
3
my
to 5
point.
years.
It's a philosophic discussion about how you approach it, and practically it has all kinds of ramifications. The system they have is the system they have, and it ain't gonna
But
change.
there's no perfect system. I mean, you look at Meridian Ranch right now, and they pay about the same as we do every month, but yet they still have a mill levy.
Yeah.
they get taxed.
Let me ask you a
Well,
question
and the thing
that,
was,
let me ask you a question that
if you had
piggybacks
a
on this and that I
building
think maybe
and taxes
interprets it a little bit.
The county commissioners had to approve the
Yes.
special
The
district.
Tabor growth limitation.
Hang on a second, we got a couple people talking, go ahead.
The Tabor growth limitation, which limits the amount that the budget in year X can grow from the budget in year X minus one, does that growth limitation apply to revenues that are generated by fees as opposed to taxes?
There is a little more leniency in fees,
There's more leniency in
Yeah.
fees. Okay.
but I can't tell you exactly what, I mean, still, it's a very complicated formula.
Yeah.
There's still a percentage,
Yeah.
even with the fees.
So that means the board could not
Now,
raise
if you're
fees.
doing new facilities that are new revenues, those are probably accepted from that formula.
Exactly.
As there are always exceptions,
Well, yeah.
with
Right.
taxes also.
But that's what but if you say you wanna do a third rec facility that was gonna generate its own revenue.
You're gonna give Troy a stroke.
Yeah.
You mean because that's
That's it.
is that because,
Extend a water line.
Eric, is that because that's an enterprise?
Yes.
Okay, that's, so, but that means, is it correct then to say that if there are limitations on the growth of the budget from year to year, even if the revenues are generated by fees and not taxes, therefore, it is not the case that the board of a district that runs on fees could raise the fees any amount that it wants, because that would make the revenues, or at least if it did that, it would have to refund.
If you bring in more than what Tabor allows, it would have to be.
You'd have to
dispersed right
refund it.
back out.
So you could increase the fees, but you would simply have to refund the excess.
Yeah, right.
Or ask for a public vote.
Plus, the people sitting on this board are also fee payers.
Yes.
And
Oh, yeah.
they have their own limitations that they're wanting to impose on fee increases. And
Mr.
then,
Page,
and then that's supported by people sitting in the audience hammering on why are they raising fees. So that's kind of a voting process right there.
Mr. Pace?
Thank you, Ms. Bendel. All right, excellent. So I'm gonna frame that in the form of a question to y'all, to you, Ms. Jacobson. What is the limit, once they reach a certain number in the monies they have saved, they have to refund the excess, is that correct?
Yeah, under Tabor, yes.
Under Tabor, what is it 4%, 6%?
It's a formula.
It's a formula.
Change.
That's what I'm going to ask somebody, do you have that formula?
It's right in Tabor.
Then I'm gonna go do Tabor and ask that question.
And
That's
the
what I-
auditors for the district would be the best ones asked.
I'm going to, I don't know who our new district administrator is, I got an idea. So hopefully, maybe I'm wrong, but we'll see.
Inflation plus population growth.
Any other questions?
Essentially.
Well, sir, I'm golden.
All right, good. Hopefully we've addressed everybody's concerns. I have floating answers to come regarding the promissory note and the Parks and Rec money. Mr. Stiver wants to raise the issue regarding this entity, and I ain't going there, because that's not a bond discussion. I'm not disagreeing with your approach, I'm just saying that's not part of today's discussion.
Well, we can make it part of
No,
the discussion
we're not.
by simply asking, when Woodmen Hills owned 150 houses, did Woodmen Hills Metro District pay the park and rec fee?
Okay. Mr. Chairman, anything else?
No, I think, it's enough to get us started on our.
Okay.
Quest.
I hope everybody feels today was helpful.
Very
Yes.
much, thank you very much.
Okay, and as said at the beginning, well, because I was late, I didn't get to say it at the beginning, but I'm gonna say it now. No action today, no votes today, no motions today. This is a study session, educational section, special session under, the Special District Association manual. Okay, so, that's kind of no ground rules, so to speak, in the sense of nothing really happening, it's just, and Mr. Pace, you and I will never get along, so be it. But I hope your concerns have been addressed today and you've had the opportunity to ask questions as you chose.
I will be asking Mr. Jacobson via what you said earlier about resolutions that were public record. Hopefully you still have some of them. I'm gonna be asking him to ask you
Okay,
to see if I can get those and.
and I have no idea from what happened
It was
15,
earlier,
18 years ago.
he said he had the things I'm gonna ask for them, so
Okay,
it's either yes or a no, it'll be that simple.
Okay.
I'm retiring December 31st, so.
I thought you
I'm
were already
retiring.
retired.
Huh?
I thought you were already retired.
You'll have that
Well,
request
for all
tomorrow.
intents and purposes, we stopped.
Who's taking your place?
What was
stopped
the
taking-
big bond issue you just finished last week?
Well, $2.5 billion for the airport.
Okay.
Who's taking your place?
That
This-
would warm
this
me
is
out.
chump change. 2.5 billion. I hope you
This is
feel
for the
better, whatever this is bothering.
Redo of the whole Great Hall and.
No, I mean, who's taking your place?
Oh,
Is
okay.
somebody
My
at
wife
your
is,
firm?
my wife is the Becker of our firm and I'm the Stowe and, the firm will no longer be doing business after the end of the year.
Are we adjourned?
But will have some people to recommend taking over.
Yeah, we're adjourned.
Thank you.